All right, so we've got this model that argues that the more deeply you process information, the better you will remember that information. And we've got pretty good breakdown of the kinds of processes that should produce shallow, mid-range, and deep processing. Pretty good. Not perfect. Pretty good. All right. So, under this model, there are very specific reasons why a deeper level should matter. Um, First off, they argue that deeper processing is going to lead to a more durable memory. That if you process for meaning, for example, you're more likely to produce a memory trace that will stay, not decay, not be placed. They don't use terms in the levels of processing model like short term and long term memory, but I'm going to use them because I think it's easier to understand one model by kind of comparing it to the other ones. And so, if you recall back, the argument of the short term memory store was that information decays out of the short term memory store. Levels of processing argues that the more deeply you process something, the less likely you would have decay. Right now, they're not saying it's because it would only be in the short term memory store, but they are making the argument that it's less likely to decay. So, you want to have a good, solid memory trace created. Another reason why the levels matter is something called the elaboration hypothesis. In this hypothesis, when you process something semantically, it links that new information to old things that you already know. So I told you a couple of chapters back that there are actually two ways that we use the phrase semantic or the term semantic in cognitive psychology. One refers to processing for meaning. The other is to describe an actual memory store that we have in our memory system. And we're going to talk about this more in another chapter, but I'm just going to give you a little foreshadowing. According to the levels of processing model, elaboration on an incoming stimulus benefits not only from the meaning of the new stimulus, right? Connecting it to the meanings that you already have stored in your existing memory store, but also um, attaches it, stores it into that semantic network of information, this big basic memory warehouse that you have called the semantic memory store. All the things that you know and understand in a deep way would be housed in the semantic memory store. So the elaboration hypothesis is taking advantage of both ways that we use the word semantic. The key thing to remember is that by linking new information to old information, it makes it more durable in your memory store, and it makes it more likely to be placed into that durable memory store. Now, the distinctiveness hypothesis, which I kind of alluded to when I was talking about the presidents, the distinctiveness hypothesis says that the more differentiated the codes are, the more memorable they will be. So I was kind of making the case that, Abraham Lincoln might be recalled because he's distinctive. There are more differentiated codes associated with Abraham Lincoln than with Garfield. I can't even tell you that guy's first name. So Lincoln, there's more that you know about him. Like he's on certain coins and bills. He made certain kinds of changes. He was assassinated. He wore a top hat. I mean, like, there are things that you've been taught that are very differentiated about him. All these different details. A, a piece of information that has that many different kinds of things that you might know gives you all these different ways to retrieve that information. So if you're primed with top hat, might pop up. If you are primed with honest, right? Because wasn't he called Honest Abe? So if you're primed with honest, if you're primed with holiday in February, if you're primed with Civil War, I mean, there's just, if you're primed with assassination, if you're primed with John Wilkes Booth, if you're primed with lots of different things, it would all distill down into this one thing that shares all these differentiated codes. So that's the thing that makes the distinctiveness hypothesis powerful, is that if you can have more ways that you processed information, you'll have more ways to find it when you want to retrieve it. So the levels of processing model talks not just about how you get information into your memory being important, but it also talks about it's acknowledging that you have to get it back out. I mean, it's one thing to store it into your long-term memory under the modal model, but how are you going to store it in such a way that it's really easy to retrieve later? And the levels of processing model says, well, if you process it semantically, if you tie it to things you already know, it's going to be a lot more memorable. It's going to be a lot more organized. Our textbook has this really cute picture where it compares a nice orderly library organized by the Dewey Decimal System and then a room that just has stacks of unorganized books. Like, which one is going to be easier to find the particular book that you want? The one that's organized and labeled and tied to each other through some kind of logical system, or the one where you're just going to have to dig through every pile looking for it, right? And ideally, our memories in our brain are organized more like the library and less like the disorganized room. The more ways you can look for it, the better. So one thing about the elaboration and the distinctiveness hypotheses is that they are tied together. The more you elaborate on something, the more distinctive that thing becomes. So the more ways that you think about that information, the more distinctive it starts to become in your memory. You can use some of these strategies for studying for classes because one of the things I love about teaching psychology, not the least of which because just like the subject matter is awesome, but what I love about it for students on the student side is that it's easy to tie the things that you're learning in class to stuff you know about how the world works or how your friends act or how your own memory functions or other kinds of things, right? It's really easy to figure out ways to tie new information you're learning in class to things that you have experienced in real life. And so I really love that about my subject matter, right? If you can elaborate, it will make it more distinctive, therefore more memorable. Now, the arguments against the levels of processing model. And this is a really coherent, very specific, and completely relevant argument. I told you I've been in love with this model for my entire career, and I can't get away from this problem. What's a deep process? Something that leads to a durable memory. What leads to durable memories? Deep processes. Well, but what's a deep process? Anything that leads to a durable memory. And we're in this circle where we never really clarify. Now, I gave you some definitions of what was a deeper process, right? Like semantic processing is a deeper process. Okay. But which semantic process? There have been all sorts of attempts to pin down exactly what constitutes a deep process for basically anyone to use that would be effective for just about anyone. Like, what constitutes a good universal deep process? And lots of different things have been tried. Some are better than others. But have we defined exactly what a deep process is? We have not. We have not. Now, I told you I was struggling with how long the memory is retained, because if the levels of processing model is accurate, the deeper processes lead to better memory immediately. Does that matter over time? One of the things that people have been arguing for like 20 years is that we need to start implementing some of the findings from cognitive psychology into our actual classrooms so that we can benefit students' memories, so that like learning is more likely, that memory of this content is more likely. And one of the big debates we always get into is, are we trying to produce better memory for the tests in this class, or are we trying to produce better memory of this material over time? I'd like to argue that the reason why you go to college is because over time, you want to know the stuff that you learned in college. Like, we aren't just trying to put you through some system where you check off some boxes and you come out basically the same person you were when you entered. Like, that doesn't seem like a useful process to me. Like, I would like to think that you're learning stuff. We should be moving forward as a function of having gone to college. And so I would like to make the argument that whichever of these models is more accurate, that the goal of teaching people content in classes is so that someday when they're, in their 50s, 30 years after having had this class or something, they actually could say, hey, you know what? I learned about that in college, and I know something very relevant to what we're talking about. You don't not have to go look it up like it's brand new and I never saw it before. But I actually remember having learned this in class. Like, how do we make that kind of memory? Now, of course, I'm not going to test over the course of 30 years because that it means I'd never know how this works out. So, what I did was I did 28 days as my retention delay. So, I taught people a list of paired associates and they process the material either. Let me go back to my list of processes for you. There we are. So I had three, and in the first experiment, I had the three conditions. So I had, does it contain an E? I had another structural process was how many letters did the word contain? And then I had a semantic task, which was whether the word was pleasant or unpleasant. And in fact, your textbook has the original study from 1969 that Hayden Jenkins conducted, and I basically replicated that. But Hayden Jenkins did immediate recall, and I did a 4-week delay. And what I found is that it didn't matter whether you did a deep process or a shallow process over time. Pretty much everybody forgot everything. Pretty much everybody forgot everything over 30 days. Now, they were dumb. It was a dumb list of words, salt and pepper and table and chair. And I also did it with like categorical things where it was like tools and animals and stuff. And what I did find was that the people who did the semantic processes did, when they remembered something, remembered things from the pair or from the category. So maybe they only remembered two things, but they wrote salt and pepper. Whereas the person who had done the shallow task wrote salt, and that was it. Or they wrote salt and blossom. So what they did remember was organized, but nobody really remembered anything over the course of a month. So, and what I tried to do was mock up what it's like in real life, where I didn't warn them that I was going to test them again in a month. I just said, and then the next phase of the study is in a month, and we'll be, doing the instructions. So I'll be calling you to make sure you come, and really hounded people to make sure they returned and stuff. And then another way that I did it was in a classroom. So I just surprised them in their same classroom. So they didn't even have to, I didn't even have to reveal to them that there was more to the study. I just surprised them. And basically, it didn't matter the depth of processing. So it kind of undermines, now to go back to arguments, whether this model makes sense at all, or it maybe is that the deep process that I used was not deep enough. Maybe rating for pleasantness wasn't a deep enough process. Well, what's a deep process? Something that learns. So do I keep changing processes until I get better memory from the deep group than I got from the shallow group? Maybe. Maybe that's the solution. But because the model doesn't tell you what exactly constitutes a deep process, you're sort of just chasing it. And so that's the big argument against the levels of processing model. All right, let's compare these three theories just for fun, and then we'll move into another topic. Okay, so the modal model of memory that argues that there's a short-term and a long-term memory store. One pro of it is that it accounts for the anterograded amnesia experiences, and it also explains immediate forgetting. Like I just processed this information and got distracted for a second, and now I can't remember, right? Like that explains that experience in life, right? The working memory with the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, its pro is that it's got this one big system rather than these different boxes that the modal model has. And it also has the pro of explaining that kind of temporary storage that we have that exists past 30 seconds, right? And so that it does have that advantage. The levels of processing that argues the depth of processing is the important thing. Again, has one big system, which is nice, not having to imagine things moving through boxes. And it does account for why people will recall information differently based on how they processed it rather than how frequently they processed it or something like that. Just really honestly what task they performed while on the material. So it's good for that. So each of them has kind of a pro and kind of a con. Ideally, what will happen eventually, maybe some of you will be psychologists of the future, and you'll figure out a way to sort of bring all three of these models together and make it into one coherent explanation of how memory functions. That's the goal, ideally. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. Ooh, I've got your interest. Why have I got the seven dwarfs here? So we'll come back after our break and talk about that next.